All right, sounds like we're live. So in this next section, what we're going to do is have the panelists make some comments on what they saw in the environmental baseline documents, and also give them the opportunity to talk to the consultants and get some clarifications if they'd like. And I guess before I start with that, Philip Ackelcock has pointed out that the pronunciation of the river is Kochtuli. Kochtuli. Okay. Thanks, Philip. All right. So I think what we'd like to do is let Hal Geiger start us off, since we kind of assigned Hal this section of the document.
Maybe I'll see if I can kind of turn those into questions. But when I went through the document, one of the first things I noticed is there's statistics that have been gathered on Bristol Bay, particularly sockeye, but on Bristol Bay fisheries going back to the 1890s. And there's been a huge body of research that's been done by the Fisheries Research Institute at the University of Washington, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and pretty much all of the work has been in units of adult fish. There's probably the best kept series is the commercial catch in units of adult fish. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game has attempted to make estimates of escapement, which is kind of our jargony word for the number of fish that breed to make more fish in the future. And those are in units of adult fish. So the first thing that jumped right out at me was this issue of index escapement. And particularly when using index or some version of that word as a verb, it looks like it means that the rules of algebra have been suspended. Now, that said, this is a huge big problem, I think, in Alaska. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game, which is kind of the guide here, or the leaders, they are often very inconsistent and confusing in how they use the word index. But one of the things that we've seen in the introduction, in both the document and the introduction today, is that there's a need to characterize what's out there right now. And in order to make some comparison in a science context, at some point we're going to need to convert everything into units of adult fish, and the index doesn't do that. That said, I completely agree with what Mary Louise said about the problems with making that conversion using the area under the curve if you don't have the key ingredients. And I agree with her that would have been a big mistake to just run numbers through the machine and crank out estimates if they're not good. But at some point, if Alaskans are going to make trade-offs between the value of a mine and the value of those minerals and the value of the fishery, there needs to be some more algebraic thinking so that you can look at the value of the fish that are potentially going to be diminished by the mine. And maybe I have some maybe I'll turn that into a question, but I might have some suggestions as to how future work that could be done. With the aerial counts, I know as I read through the document, there's even the word enumerate popped up, and I have never flown over those particular salmon in those particular streams and rivers, but I know usually these aren't counts, they're visual impressions, and there's a huge big difference from one observer to another. When in the early 2000s, my colleague Steve Heinel and I went through the database of aerial counts that had been done on pink salmon in southeast Alaska. What we found is some observers, on average, were counting half or less the number of, or their visual impressions were half or less than what other observers were when they'd only flown 3 or 4 days apart looking at the same fish. We found other observers that didn't seem to have a whole lot of relationship. Their impressions had very little relationship to the number of fish that were, or they had very little relationship to what other observers saw. So there seemed to be some observers that just had very, very poor observer efficiency. And the other important thing we saw was that as the number of fish increased in a particular stream, the observers couldn't really tell the difference. I mean, all the observers could pretty much see what very few fish looked like, and they could all kind of see what sort of an intermediate number of fish looked like. But as that number of fish doubled or even went up by a factor of 10, the observers had a hard time seeing that the number of fish went up very much. So that leads me to the idea that if we're going to be using these index counts at all, there needs to be a lot of work done to convince an open-minded skeptic that they really counted something accurately. And that kind of collides with this idea of the data secrecy. So as I sat down to try to evaluate what I thought of these index numbers, all I really got out of it was where experts trust us, which isn't probably adequate for a mine situation like this. The other thing I would want to say is the Holt and Cox paper, Kendra Holt's paper, is cited as a justification for using the index counts in this context. I think that's, I went back and looked at that paper very carefully. I don't think that this situation is really appropriate for the kind of estimation that they were talking about, and I can expand on that. Getting back to this idea of thinking algebraically, the Chinook salmon and the sockeye salmon are sometimes graphed on the same graphs, and the sockeye salmon are much more abundant. But at some point, there's going to have to be a way to think about the value of these different resources. And anybody who's been to a meeting on Chinook salmon bycatch, say with the trawl fishery, realize that these Chinook salmon are valued quite differently than sockeye salmon, and just looking at the ex-vessel value or the commercial value of them is very unimportant. I know this will come up in some other meetings later, but it's part of just a general criticism I have that a lot of the data has been collected and the summaries have been made without an ability to think algebraically and move back and forth between value and abundance and total biomass. So I guess I would like to get back to the question of characterizing the size of the anadromous salmon populations, and maybe ask Mary Louise, what have you all thought about how you're going to get to a point where you can tell the Alaskan public what is the current state of these population sizes?
I don't believe that Pebble intends to estimate populations. The refinement that they made in 2008 was to move into a habitat-based evaluation. And you'll see this afternoon as we talk about in-stream flow, habitat availability, and I think they've, the concern with getting good, accurate counts and that give you any kind of confidence compared to the catch statistics is one that they've grappled with, and we haven't been able to come up with a good answer. As I mentioned, we did try towers. The tower was set up by Alaska Department of Fish and Game. It was operated by employees trained by Fish and Game, APCS and R2 employee trained by Fish and Game to do tower counts, and just don't want to ruin the thesis for anybody, but didn't work at all in First Creek.
Well, then how would Alaskans go about making a value judgment about potential trade-offs between the value of minerals that could be realized by a mine and the value of the salmon resource that might be diminished by a mine?
I don't have an answer for you.
Well, I guess those are I guess my main points right now. I guess I would suggest thinking about maybe a large radio tagging study, especially for Chinook salmon. This would probably be very expensive because you need to use hundreds of tags per year, and you need to replicate this in time. Those tags probably, I don't know what they cost now, but they probably cost about $150, $200 a tag, and you need hundreds of them. But that would allow you to be able to that would allow the partnership to go to the Alaskan public and say, well, here's where these salmon are, and here's something about the abundance. So we can now use algebra to start thinking about value and so forth, and consider trade-offs.
Thanks, Al. Just go down the line so you have some comments.
Well, my responsibility was the Cook Inlet side, so but I do have one perspective that I guess when it comes to trade-offs, I guess I was missing sort of the larger context of, for instance, the Lake Iliamna population overall. And some of my colleagues have published on the portfolio effect of having all these diverse populations, metapopulations, different spawning habitats that, by their variability, still support a strong, resilient fishery and over the whole system. And so I guess my question is, where does the populations, particularly talaric populations, fit in that broader portfolio context? And what does it represent as the whole system? And I guess I might say that even about the Cook Inlet studies is there wasn't really a broader context to what any potential impact would represent in that system. And in this case, the sockeye population, which is what they addressed in that portfolio issue. And so I don't know, Mary Louise, if it isn't in the BCD, but is that a consideration at all? Even though you're not addressing populations per se, and it's not a responsibility to generate that yourselves, but there is information on the context of the, I don't say threatened, but the populations under potential influence of the development.
Yeah, I think that it was an attempt to get at that was made in the EBD, where we used index counts. That's all we had, and we put it on the same graph as escapement statistics. They're apples and oranges, and we understand that. But I think our objective there in doing so, even though they're not directly comparable, as Hal pointed out, was to give some kind of scale, and the numbers. I guess the real concern that folks that I've talked to over the years about this is that the numbers that we're looking at in these systems are within the error of the estimates that are being made at the commercial and catch statistic level, and how do you ever grapple with that statistically? And maybe there are ways, and maybe there are people that could be engaged and could help with that particular problem. That's a decision for Pebble to make.
Jeep, do you have some comments? And maybe I'll say, you see what Jeep is doing there. There's a lot of people watching on the web and on video, and if you guys could remember to bring the mics close to you, that would really be helpful.
Put it away from me because I cough about every 3 minutes or so. Thought I'd try to shield that from everybody. One thought I had is it looked like to me there's fish everywhere by your guys' presentation and whatnot. The one talked about indexing the habitat, and I think that was with the prey and insects and that sort of thing. But I was wondering, has the habitat in all these different reaches been quantified, and then can you relate that directly to fish or fish numbers? Can you quantify the habitat for specific reaches and what the response is fish-wise, so to speak, and then quantify the habitat and then scale it up? Is that any part of your thinking at all or not?
I don't think the data are there to quantify the habitat in a representative portion of the system. Clearly, I think that was the idea behind the Hank and Reeves approach, but it was limited to smaller tributaries that are wadeable and snorkelable, and unfortunately, you can't scale that from tributary habitats down to the main stem habitats. So the approach we're taking with habitat, and Dudley will talk about it this afternoon, is using the in-stream flow model and understanding the habitat that's available and how it's being used.
Just to follow up on that just a little bit, I guess the concern I would have is and I know you can't get to it very well, and it's logistically very difficult, but, what's happening to that overwinter habitat, and that's kind of a big question for me out there. Who's there in the winter, and how many of them are there? So
Yeah.
that's all I have.
Okay, Mike?
The agenda had habitat and in-stream flows listed this afternoon. I had a couple of talking points on a slide, and Mary Louise has agreed to hold till this afternoon and be around for that. And I think it'd be disruptive to take a piece of that out, talk about it now. But I do have a couple of questions. One deals with the study area, and it kind of goes across all of the chapters, the ones I touched on. There's a mine study area and a general deposit area. And it seems that there has been unequal treatment of those two between chapters, and even if I look at the fisheries and habitat, that some of the pages show that the general area goes down to include parts of the main stem. Koktuli, is it close? And to the Iliamna Lake and the lower Tulare Creek, and those aren't touched on quite so heavily, and same with the corridor. So if someone could explain how those are, the consistency amongst the different studies and throughout the study area.
Specifically for fish, are you focused specifically on fish?
The fish, and then the same thing applies to habitat and some of the other characteristics in the different chapters.
So the program evolved from 2004, which I believe I was not here in 2004, but I was really largely the recon year. They were getting up to speed, and they sent crews out, and I believe they sent crews out late, even in the field season. They had to mobilize quickly and go out, and so it was really 2004 was really a recon year, and then they regrouped and they reassessed, and they went out and did some structured studies in the main stem, and they really did focus on trying to get representative reaches in the main stem covered, as well as into the habitats. And I think it was more a progression of time than necessarily it's both. Over time, we looked and we filled in data gaps. As we when I became engaged in 2008, big data gaps were these tributary habitats that were very up close to the deposit area, and there wasn't a lot of coverage in those. And we knew these were, at potential risk. So we really wanted to do a thorough evaluation of the habitats. And we walked from the bottom to the top, and we characterized 20 to 25% of the habitat units were also population sampled. So you're right. I mean, there is a disproportionate amount of effort in those habitats in 2008. We attempted to conduct some main stem habitat sampling that we would be able to go back to these sites over time. And the fish just didn't cooperate with us. We did go back to the same sites 2 years in a row, and very different results came out of that. Use the same methods, or in some cases the flow was so dramatically different we couldn't even use the same method. So what value is there in collecting this data? If you have to go in the second time, use a different method. And so the concept of going to a main stem site and sampling consistently at that site, it just didn't pan out for us. And so we did what we could by study. We also had some other very focused studies. HSC, for example, Dudley will talk about, went in and specifically looked where the reds were distributed and focused their sampling on that distribution. I didn't really talk about it much. There was a rainbow trout study that expands that expands the fish distribution study effort beyond the 3 watersheds into the Iliamna Lake watershed, so down to the Kwijak and other systems. So it was study specific, and it evolved over time, and it incorporated looking in and seeing where the data gaps were and what we could really fill in.
I have one more, and that maybe I missed this. Maybe it's in the documents. I didn't read this fish part quite as closely as the other, but that's the seasonal movement. You focused quite heavily on the presence of fish, but then the anadromous fish have to get there. How do you characterize the importance of the different streams for seasonal movement, particularly the ones that on the South Fork that doesn't flow all the time, and some of the others that you mentioned that have lesser, I guess, permanent habitats?
The intermittent flow reach in the South Fork, affects fish distributions sometimes. I'm sure it does. It goes dry. Has to, right? I mean, they can't walk across it. So we didn't do studies of movements other than the adfluvial rainbow trout. And there was another study, an attempt early on to look at grayling, tag grayling, and look for the grayling spawning. They weren't able to find any. So the studies on movements were very limited. Around the intermittent reach, we did look for stranding. Fish were documented stranding in that reach, but we didn't look for the timing of the opening or the closing and how that would affect movements.
Okay, well, I guess I noticed that Andrew's gotten off a little bit lightly. I wonder if the panel has any comments or questions about the benthic organisms.
I wish I did.
Any other from the panel members?